In the mid-1800s, Ignaz Semmelweis walked the corridors of the Vienna General Hospital. He was tormented by a mystery he couldn't ignore. Women were dying in childbirth, not from labour itself, but from a fever that struck them down days after delivering their babies. Yet, no one knew why it happened or how to stop it. Semmelweis, a young Hungarian physician, discovered that doctors and medical students that were moving between autopsies and delivery rooms without washing their hands were carrying bacteria that was causing their deaths. Semmelweis introduced a simple solution: hand washing with chlorinated lime. When he introduced hand washing in his maternity ward, mortality rates plummeted from 18% to less than 2%. Now, you would think he would have been praised for his remarkable discovery. Instead, Semmelweis was met with resistance from his medical peers. They dismissed his findings as an attack on their professionalism, their hygiene, and even their masculinity. Semmelweis would argue his case by publishing statistics, writing papers, and arguing his case passionately. But he failed to convince other doctors and was shunned by his peers and had to leave the hospital. No matter how hard he tried, no one would listen. And eventually, his own health started to deteriorate, and he spent his last days in a mental asylum, dying at the young age of just 47 years old. What if Semmelweis had taken a different approach? Instead of trying to persuade with just his numbers, what if he had told a different story? One that was themed around human cost. Imagine him gathering his fellow doctors, not to berate them with statistics, but to tell them about the grieving husbands and the motherless children. Imagine him saying, every time you touch a patient without washing your hands, you are unknowingly killing the people you are actually trying to save. You don't see it, you don't mean to, but it's there. By connecting emotionally, by showing his peers the human faces behind the numbers, he might have changed their minds. And history might have remembered him as a hero, instead of someone who no one really remembers. Fast forward to the pandemic of 2020. Suddenly, hand washing wasn't just a medical protocol. It became a global obsession. Governments, scientists, and public health officials told us to wash our hands, not through cold data alone, but through stories and visuals. They showed us videos of how germs spread, they shared anecdotes of lives saved. And we listened. We washed our hands. It became a habit, ingrained into every one of us, even young children. Semmelweis was ahead of his time. His science was sound, but his message didn't land. And that's the difference storytelling can make. It transforms facts into meaning and data into action. So on today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Geoff White, a master storyteller. He's an investigative journalist who is the co-host of one of the most popular BBC technology podcasts titled The Lazarus Heist. Let's jump into it.
I'm sure this counts as a superpower, would be the power of storytelling, would be the ability to take something and then make it into a story. And one of the stories in that book was about North Korea and how North Korea became this computer hacking superpower. So I wrote that story for crime.com, then pitched it to the BBC as a podcast. So what we looked at in season 1 of the podcast was, we start with the Sony hack, because again, from a storytelling point of view, it's in Hollywood, it's got celebrities. They then go on to hack into Bangladesh Bank and attempt to steal $1 billion.
From the city of Peaky Blinders, Birmingham, England, I would like to introduce you to Paddy Dandar.
As the world becomes more automated and the robots take over, it's imperative that we build the right human skills for the future. So pull up a chair, grab a samosa or two, and make yourself very uncomfortable. Thank you so much, folks, for joining me for another episode of the Superpower School podcast. I'm your host, Paddy Danda, and on today's show, I have someone very special. He is an investigative journalist. I've said the word right, just about. And he's a freelance journalist who has done some amazing work in the world of cybersecurity. I met Geoff at a event recently where he presented the story of the Lazarus Heist, which is the world famous podcast that he has been co-hosting and co-presenting. So thank you so much, Geoff White, today for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
And I hear you're in the BBC right now.
I am. I'm working on I was saying a top secret project. It's not really top secret, but because it'll be broadcast at some stage. But yeah, I'm working on a documentary for them, so it should be interesting.
Oh, amazing. And Geoff, I'm going to jump right into it. I mean, somebody who is in your field must have a bunch of superpowers. So what superpower would you like to bring to this particular episode?
It's funny, we haven't talked about this, but there is a fun party game you can play. I don't know whether you've heard about this. It's called Undermining Superpowers.
Oh.
So the idea is you have a group of people and one person suggests a superpower and the person next to them has to undermine it in some way. So somebody might say, I want the ability to fly. And the person says to them, yeah, you can have that ability, but only while naked. Or I want the ability to walk through walls. And then the next person says, yeah, but you can only walk into the bathroom. You set up the superpower and then the next person gives some caveat that makes it completely pointless. But look, if I had to pick on one superpower that I'm sure this counts as a superpower, maybe, would be the power of storytelling, would be the ability to take something and then make it into a story and tell it as a story. I think that's really important for me, really useful for me, but important increasingly in a world where there's a cacophony of information. And also increasingly, some of that information is completely fake and made up. The ability to tell a story and actually get a real, true story and tell it, I think is really important.
Oh, amazing. I love that superpower. I think more of us should adopt it in everyday life, even when we're presenting, business presentations, etc. It just becomes
Absolutely.
a little bit more engaging. And you are a master at this because the podcast, I don't think it would have the same impact if it wasn't for the storytelling that you and your co-host bring into the episode. So it's amazing. And so did you always want to be a journalist? What were some of the things that you were thinking about as a young lad as you were growing up?
No, I had no real idea what I wanted to do. The closest I got to it was I did a degree in law. And I think at one stage I did want to be a lawyer. But I think even then I had this idea that I'd be sort of standing up in court as a barrister and doing what they do on these police dramas where, I put it to you, Your Honour, that, and catching people out in court. And so I think even then there was a sort of kind of performative element, that the idea that there would be an audience that I would be in front of. And so then started thinking about journalism. I worked for a tech company for a long while and did some tech stuff for them, not on a particularly deep level. I'm not a coder by any stretch of the imagination or a software developer, but that gave me sort of grounding in tech. And then when the dot-com crash happened, that company went sideways and I got made redundant. And I was thinking what I would do with myself. And there was a course in journalism that I'd been looking at and thought about doing. And because I was unemployed, the course cost £10 for unemployed people. So I turned up with my £10 note and I signed up for the course, and then that was it. Trained as a journalist, became a journalist. I always had this idea that, being an investigative journalist would be quite cool. And I always had this idea of, I'll be an investigative journalist one day and I'll travel the world. But I had no idea sort of how to do that and how that worked. So eventually the idea that I've actually become that is something that's quite stunning to me. So yeah, journalism was something I sort of edged into in the way that a lot of people during that era did. A lot of people I trained with had started out on other careers and then ended up in journalism. These days, I think it's much more common for people to start out and say, I want to be a journalist. Back in my day, it was much more of an organic career that people sort of ended up in after failing at other things.
I have to say, I actually commented on your talk when I saw you, and I said to somebody, that's one of the best presentations I've seen for a long, long time, because you were so polished. You were just so engaging, and the element of storytelling. And I'm not just saying this because, you're on the show, but I genuinely sat there and felt like this is the way people should present. And it's a topic that I've never really got into, like cybersecurity. For me, it's not a subject that I would say I wake up in the morning and go, I want to know about it. It's just something that's there. But the way you implemented that kind of storytelling, but just the way you presented as well, I just felt was masterful and a real masterclass in presentation. Were you always like that? I mean, and I'm sure you've practiced and it's taken time, but what have been some of your big learning points to kind of get to that level of being able to craft a story in that way?
That's really kind. Thanks for your comments. It's great to know that it comes across that way on the other side, on the audience side. In terms of storytelling, I think part of it is my upbringing in that my mum is Irish, Liverpudlian Catholic, and obviously that there's a great storytelling tradition around that, you know. And my dad, a completely different background, but he really loved radio comedy. He loved Radio 4 comedy. Programs like Round the Horn and The Goon Show, which will be familiar to a certain demographic of people, like these classic Radio 4 comedy shows, sketch shows. And so the idea of storytelling, the idea of a punchline, the idea that you were going to, you know, tell some kind of tale that would have a sort of thrilling punchline-y type ending was something I really grew up with a lot at home. And you would have these, you know, family dinners, or we'd invite people around or whatever, and there'd always be this thing of somebody would hold forth with a story, and you were sort of trying to keep the audience going with your story. So that kind of, you know, I think that kind of seeped into my blood as a kid. And when I was doing journalism for Channel 4 News and for BBC and for others, and the local newspaper stuff as well that I started out doing, it frustrated me that we had to boil everything down to just a few hundred words or just a few minutes. And the really frustrating thing that I found about TV news particularly was you have to start with, and this is print news as well, text news, you start with the hard news line. Today we learned this, you know, terror attackers struck here, you know, these people have run out of money. You start with the news line, what's new, and you start hard. Interesting, if you read US newspapers, they don't do that at all. You know, the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, their intros are very kind of, you know, people are milling around this venue. They can't understand what's happened to them. And then by the third paragraph, you finally get to what's happened, which is there's been a bombing at some place. We don't do that in the UK. We start hard on the newsline. That frustrated me because it went against the storytelling history that I had, where you work up to the punchline. You know, you work up to what happened. You start the story at the beginning, and then you work your way through to the end. And by the time people get to the end, they want to know what's happened. So I always felt I was fighting against the storytelling as a journalist. So what's been great with doing podcasts and with books is people will give you a bit of wiggle room. You know, they're not like reading a newspaper where they want to know, bang, what's the story in the first paragraph. You can spend a few minutes setting things up and say, you know, here's this person, and here's when they woke up, and here's what happened, and they switched on their computer and they discovered this thing. And people will go with you a little bit. And they like that sort of storytelling, story spinning. So that's been how I've moved into doing longer form stuff, podcasts and books, just because you've got the scope, the range to tell a story. And podcasting's been very innovative for that. Podcasting as a storytelling medium, I think, has been really important, really impactful, and has allowed more storytelling and better storytelling. So that's why I'm able to give talks like the one you came along to, is I've obviously practiced that talk in the podcast, and I've given other talks, and you sort of get the hang of what are the twists and turns, what are the plot movements that are really cool, and also what are the details that I need to tell people so they understand the bits in the story that they need to understand.
Oh, amazing. Because I was a big introvert when I was much younger. I still am. I often tell people I used to be a professional introvert because I'm the last person to stand up in front of people or even ask a question in class. And now I would say I'm addicted to conversation because I do this podcast. I get to speak to amazing people. And just in terms of my job, I do lots of presenting. And I would say if somebody had said to me as a kid, this is what you'll be doing in the future, I would have just never believed them. And it's a real journey, and I can appreciate, even for yourself, it's that practice and just each time being a little bit more uncomfortable, I guess, and then learning from that, isn't it? And then hopefully that helps you improve. So yeah, really, really great to hear that. And so the Lazarus Heist, let's talk about the podcast that you've been working on. Just remind us, how long has it been since you started that? particular podcast?
Well, the kind of story goes back to almost 2018, which is when I started writing my first book, which is called Crime.com. And one of the stories in that book was about North Korea and how North Korea became this computer hacking superpower, which is obviously a very unlikely story given North Korea's population. Most of them don't even have a computer, let alone the internet. And so I wrote that story for Crime.com, then pitched it to the BBC as a podcast. And the bit of the BBC that I pitched it to is the BBC World Service. And I didn't appreciate at the time how canny that was. It was kind of a bit of an accident that that's where it ended up, because it's a global story. It takes into account, obviously, North Korea, South Korea, Philippines, Bangladesh, New York, Japan, all these different destinations. So for the World Service, that was a great, sort of really tempting offer. And so what we looked at in season 1 of the podcast was several things, actually. We start with the Sony hack, because again, from a storytelling point of view, it's in Hollywood, it's got celebrities, it's glamorous, good entry story, the Sony hack. Although the Sony hack's really anomalous in terms of North Korean hacking. Most of the time, North Korea's hackers are trying to get money because North Korea's under sanctions, it's broke. And that's the accusation, its hackers are going after money. Sony wasn't about money, Sony was about reputation. Sony made a film about Kim Jong-un, current leader of North Korea, that was not received well in North Korea. And so the accusation is the North Koreans hacked Sony. They then go on to hack into Bangladesh Bank and attempt to steal $1 billion. They don't get the $1 billion, which is part of the sort of plot of the podcast. And in season 1, we also looked at WannaCry, which was the famous ransomware attack from 2017. People may remember hit the NHS disproportionately. So all that was sort of season 1. Season 2, we then moved on to look at North Korea's subsequent movements, hijacking cash points around the world and making them spit out money. It's an amazing exercise. And also cryptocurrency thefts. North Korea is estimated to have made upwards of $3 billion out of raiding crypto companies. And that was valued at the time of the theft. Crypto's obviously gone up in value recently, so that would be worth way more than $3 billion if the North Koreans had played their cards right. So that was kind of the genesis of it. We started making the podcast. It was just at the beginning of lockdown. I remember it was just as lockdowns were starting to be announced. It's about February 2020. I had the first meetings. So we made the whole series during lockdown, and it took about sort of 2 years. I think season 2 went out in 2022, early part of 2022. There is, by the way, loads more activity the North Koreans have done. They went on to even bigger and better things. So arguably there's room for sort of season 3 maybe of the podcast. We are just sort of give the game away. We are trying to get a documentary made of the Lazarus Heist story, or at least Lazarus Group story, to sort of tell that, in documentary form. And what would be great with that would we could bring in all those latest, greatest moves for the North Koreans that they were accused of doing. So that's kind of the genesis for how that all works out.
As I listened through the podcast, one of the things that's really struck me is just how creative the Lazarus Heist group are, because you just mentioned there about 5 or 6 different approaches they've taken. And if you were to break those down each time, they've just been super creative. I know it's like malevolent creativity, but they've actually had to really think this through and find loopholes, etc., etc. Would you share a little bit about the Bangladesh heist? Because for me, that was one that really struck out, because it was just such a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
Just some of the things they did as part of that particular attempt at stealing that money.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was the raid on Bangladesh Bank back in 2015. It's the National Bank of Bangladesh, so it's like the Bank of England or the New York Fed or whatever. It's the national institution rather. Hackers broke in 2015. Very simple method. They sent phishing emails pretending to be a job hunter to the HR department, and someone in HR clicked to download the CV, which was in a zip file, and within that zip file was a computer virus. Bangladesh Bank systems got infected. They then sniffed their way around the bank. They worked out that Bangladesh actually kept about $1 billion in an account in New York at the New York Fed. And so they wanted to target that money. They realized that the banks used a system called SWIFT to transfer money between themselves. And so the hackers managed to get access to the SWIFT computer within inside Bangladesh Bank and simply typed in some commands and said, please transfer $1 billion from our account in New York to this other account. Now, you've got to work out when to do that. Obviously, if the people in Bangladesh Bank are watching as these transactions happen, they're going to spot it. So what they did is they broke in on a Thursday evening. In Bangladesh, the weekend runs Friday to Saturday. So they knew that on Thursday night, most people would be going home for the weekend. There'd be very few people there Friday, Saturday to spot this. So that's when they started doing the transfer. Now, in the New York Fed, it was Thursday going into Friday, people are still active in the New York Fed. So they started putting through the transactions. However, the money was going to go to a bank branch in Manila, in a place called Jupiter Street, a little bank branch in this tiny street, the back street in Manila. That word Jupiter became hugely significant because, completely unconnected to this, Jupiter is the name of a ship that was caught dodging sanctions on Iran. And so the New York Fed, where the Bangladesh Bank's money was kept, had a system that spotted any dodgy transactions and looked out for keywords. And so when the hackers tried to transfer the billion to Jupiter Street, Jupiter flashed up on the New York Federal Reserve Bank's screen, not because it was the bank branch that they were dealing with, but because it happened to be the name of this sanctioned vessel. And they stopped a lot of the transactions. So only 81 million got through to the Philippines. There it arrives in the bank in Jupiter Street. It's then removed in cash. $81 million in cash is a ton, like actually literally a ton of cash. It weighs about the same as a grand piano. They put it in trucks. They take the money to casinos in the Philippines. At the time, casinos were not covered by money laundering regs, so they could take the cash in, change it into chips, and gamble it in the casinos. And the way they did this was they used private rooms in the casinos, so they had a very contained environment to put the money into. Obviously, all the people in that room in the casino are working with the money launderers at this stage, and they're playing baccarat. And with baccarat, it's a game of chance, basically. If you're good at baccarat, over the long term, you get back about 90% of what you put in. So the people playing baccarat and laundering this money knew that if they played baccarat for long enough with this 81 million and they eked it out, they would get back about 90% of their money, which of course then they could change from chips back into cash and then leave the country. And that's exactly what happened. The money just gets spirited away and it's gone. Bangladesh Bank has never got that money back. The people of Bangladesh have never got that money back. And it's presumed that it went subsequently to Macau, which is a sort of entry point to and from North Korea, and that the North Koreans then got the money back over the border, potentially to North Korea, or kept it in Macau as a sort of slush fund for their activities. So that's, broadly speaking, the Bangladesh Bank job. Absolutely astonishing. The $1 billion hack, ultimately the $1 billion hack that failed, but 81 million is still certainly a chunk of change for North Korea.
That story resonated with me for a number of reasons, but one was the fact that India, Bangladesh, very close together, and that's the region where my parents are from. But then secondly, I've been to the Philippines a few times. We used to have an office out there from a previous organization, and I have some very good friends there. And when I heard about the fact that they'd use the Philippines as part of this heist, I could instantly connect to it. I was like, oh my God, Manila, that's where I was. And I could really connect with some of those areas around there. And even just how they used the gambling angle to get the money out, which was incredible. And, on a serious note, cyber security, it's important. We need it. It's becoming more and more important as AI is, here. And I'm sure there's lots more vulnerabilities it brings as part of that technology. But what are some of the things that I guess organizations could learn from what you've seen with the Lazarus Heist and the work that you do? Are there any sort of quick lessons that we should all be encouraged to learn very quickly?
It's interesting in that these attacks may sound very sort of high tech and, advanced, using Swift systems and using viruses and so on. And at a certain level they are. But time and time again, certainly in the cases that I've investigated, the way in for the hackers and the fraudsters as well, for lots of organized crime gangs, is through your staff, through your employees, through us, through people. In the Bangladesh Bank case, they sent emails to the HR department. If you're going to try and hack a computer server within a company, you've got to understand server architecture, the server software. Is it out of date? Is there vulnerability in it? You're going to have quite a high level of technical skill. And also, you've only really got one chance. It's one server. If it's vulnerable, it's vulnerable. But if it's not, it's not. If an organization has 1,000 employees, you've got 1,000 chances. If employee 1 doesn't respond to your phishing email, maybe employee 2 will. So you've just got much more chances. And also the level of technical skill you need is still, to get a phishing email to work and to trigger on somebody's systems is not easy. But actually composing the phishing email itself is a work of psychology. What does this employee do? What are they expecting from an email? How can I send an email that fits into what they're expecting and trick them into downloading the attachment and executing the file or clicking the link and giving their credentials? it's a work of psychology, and you don't need technical skill for that. You need psychological skill for that. So what we need to do, all of us, whichever organization we're in, and indeed, in our personal lives, is just understand that the messages we receive in our email inboxes, but increasingly on LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, these messages come from who knows who. Any of these messages can be suspect. And it's just taking that step back and that second to go, hang on, am I expecting this? They're asking me to do something. They're asking me to click this link or to check this video out. Or do I want to do that? Am I certain this is actually the person that I know? So all of us on our daily lives, unfortunately, the cost of being online and all the joy and wonder that we get from being online, the cost of that is a low level, ever-present, constant vigilance that we need, because there are malicious actors out there and they're toehold into your networks, your company's networks, or indeed just your bank accounts, is going to be the message, the phishing message, to trick you into doing something. So it's just understanding that there are bad people out there. They are sending messages to you. Be constantly on the lookout at a low level for them.
Great advice. And I think you're absolutely right. Often we're the biggest weakness in the process, aren't we? As people, we're emotional. We sometimes do things that we perhaps wouldn't do on a normal day. We're irrational at times. So those are
everybody's an off day. Yeah.
And as a fan of the show, I would be really intrigued to know some of the behind the scenes stuff. Like, how does it all work in terms of the process? Do you wake up in the morning, start doing research, or do things come to you and then you start to evolve the story from there?
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a really interesting question, that. Obviously, I'd written about the Bangladesh bank case and Sony and WannaCry, and these had been in the news. I mean, much as I say I'm an investigative journalist, there are investigative journalists who do way better stuff than I do and uncover stuff that's really, really hidden. That's not really necessarily what I do. What I'll do is start with something that's happened and that was reported, but we never really got to the bottom of. And that again goes back to that problem with news. There was loads of reporting around Sony, but we never really worked out what happened. We never really told the story in a way that people could understand, because we started with the punchline as journalists. Sony's been hacked. That's not what we do in the podcast. What we do in the podcast is introduce you to some people who worked at Sony, and you get to know them and their daily lives, and then we tell the hack through their eyes, and suddenly you understand what the hack actually meant and how it worked, because you've not just been given the straightforward newsline, you've not been given the punchline, you've been introduced to some normal people who then go through this experience, and you join them with that. So you're looking for stories where it's been in the news, it's significant, but it's not ever really been covered properly, and then you're trying to work out, okay, how do we tell this story in a way that the public can understand as a story? And key to that is those people. What I'm always looking for in any story is the person who was in the room at the time. To be quite clear about this, I'm not the story. I am the storyteller, and I'll craft it and do the interviews. And don't get me wrong, I like getting my big face on telly and my voice on the podcast. But the key thing is find the person who was in the room at the time. Those Sony employees, I want a Sony employee who was there when the hack happened. The Bangladesh bank heist, we actually interviewed the guy who did the incident response. He was first on the scene. You want that first responder who is in the seat, in the hot seat, to tell you their story. And the brilliant thing about that, from a sort of storyteller point of view, is it's really easy then to do the interview and to tell the story. Because all you do with your interviewee, when you get a good interviewee and they were there, it's very simple. You just say to them, start at the beginning. Where were you? What happened? And they say, oh, well, I was sitting at home. I was called, I got this phone call, I got this email. And then all you do as an interviewer, it's actually frighteningly easy. And I don't really tell people about this a lot, but all you do is say, and what happened then? And what happened next? And how did you feel? And how did that feel? So you're constantly trying to sort of, coach your interviewee along, but all they do is just tell the story from beginning to end. And what you're doing is trying to constantly second guess what the audience will want to know and what question they want to know. And you just ask it. So if they say, I couldn't believe all my money was gone, the obvious question you want to ask as audience is, what did you feel like? Did you, what was that going to do to you? So all you do as an interviewer, when you've got the good interviewees, you just keep going and you keep asking them the questions. And then when you're cutting together the episode or you're writing the chapter, you just follow that story along. That was one of the things, we have a story consultant, a script consultant on the Lazarus Heist podcast who helped us out. And one of the big insights she gave was just keep going with the story. When you've got a good interviewee and a first person perspective who's telling you how it was for them, just keep going with it. And I would be saying, no, but we have to stop. We have to explain what malware is, and we have to explain what a DDoS attack is, and we have to explain Swift. And the script consultant was like, no, don't. We'll come back to that. We'll do that later. Just let this person tell their story, because the listener is going to get into that story and they're going to hear it. The other thing is getting good quality audio from a technical perspective. You want to get good sound so that you can really hear that person's voice in your ears and really get into it. If you're writing a book, you want to kind of get the hang of where they were at the time, the environment they were in, the clothes they were wearing, so you can really immerse your readers and your audience in that story. But as I say, once you've found that first person witness, it's actually really easy as a journalist just to sort of to get them to map out the story. So finding the interviewees and finding the sources is really important.
And you've had lots of sources throughout. Is there one that really sticks out for you that's really memorable in terms of the experience that they had and maybe just the situation?
Yeah. One of the things that happened, it's quite rare with this as a podcast, but every now and again, if you're putting the podcast out weekly, which we did with Lazarus Heist, people do contact you, in the week before the next episode goes out. And we discovered this Japanese guy, Tadashi Sasaki, I think was his name, which is it's apparently an almost comically common Japanese name. It's like John Smith, who had done some of the work, it seemed, laundering money for the North Koreans from this big hack on Bangladesh Bank. And we've been trying to get Tadashi, we've been trying to sort of, get an interview with him to explain himself. And he hadn't contacted us. And then after the episode went out where we named him, we obviously went back and said, this is the episode. We did mention you. We did offer you the interview. You didn't accept, but here's the episode where you're featured. He came back at that point and said, right, I want to speak to you now. So we got this guy on the line. Very, very exciting to finally speak to this chap through an interpreter, because obviously I don't speak Japanese. I speak very little Japanese. And so we're trying to sort of work through this interpreter. And it was really fascinating, because what was amazing, frustrating, but also intriguing about this guy was he was the ultimate, what they call cutout. In any organized crime operation, you want a bunch of people who just don't ask any questions and just do stuff for you. He was the ultimate cutout. He didn't ask any questions. So whenever you asked him about something and said, well, when they approached you about transferring this $1 billion, didn't you ask any questions? No. Well, didn't you suspect it might be dodgy behavior? No. Well, you were getting a cut of the money. What did you think you were getting paid for? Oh, I just thought they needed help and I would help them out. But so whenever you tried to land any blows on him, he just kind of rolled, it was like the ultimate soft punch bag. You couldn't get any kind of traction with him. So in a way, it was intriguing, fascinating interview. In another way, it was really frustrating that this finally got this guy in the frame, and I was prepared to monster him in the interview, but I couldn't land a punch on him because he just had no interest he had no inquisitiveness whatsoever, and eventually hadn't been found guilty of any crime, which was the other annoying thing. So yeah, he was a fascinating character. He's the interview that sort of stands out in the whole thing for me.
I know there's other guests that you've had on there that are really putting their lives on the line, aren't they? Because North Korea, they don't like people speaking out. And so for many of those people, they're really risking a lot actually going on record, aren't they? So I can't even imagine how that must be for somebody, when you've come from that environment. That must be really tough. And I know we're fast approaching time, Geoff. In terms of the future of the podcast, are there more episodes coming out? Because I binge listened to all of them now. And I'm just waiting for more now. What's on the horizon? Can you share anything there?
Well, look, the frustrating thing was after season 2 of the podcast wrapped, North Korea then went on to do a whole bunch of other stuff, which was even more amazing. And also, for fans of the podcast, they may remember the little story about guys called Hush Puppy and Big Boss, who were 2 money launderers. Hush Puppy turned out to be a Nigerian Instagram influencer with 2 million followers. Again, after the podcast closed, I got a message. I'd written the book by this stage of the Lazarus Heist, so there's a book version of the podcast as well, which has some other stuff in it. And I got a message on LinkedIn from a Secret Service agent called Matt O'Neill, who said, I read the book, very interested and really enjoyed it. And the Hush Puppy story is very interesting. You credited that to the FBI, and actually that was a Secret Service investigation. Oh, so I messaged back and said, I'm terribly sorry, these things do happen, but I'm writing another book and I'd love to hear more about the Hush Puppy Big Boss situation. So I got on a call with Matt O'Neill and his financial investigator, a woman called Christine Pellerin, who's brilliant. And they just started explaining how they got Hush Puppy and Big Boss, which isn't in the podcast. It's not in the book, but it's a hell of a story. So in the new book that I wrote, which I published in June last year, called Rinsed, which is all about money laundering. I explain the actual inside story from the Secret Service aspect of how they got Big Boss and Hush Puppy, which is a wild, wild story. The other thing I talk about in that book, Rinsed, is the North Korean alleged hack on a video game called Axie Infinity, in which North Korea is alleged to have stolen $625 million. And that hack took 1 minute, 55 seconds to transfer the money out. Fastest theft ever. Of all time, ever. It's an astonishing story. And that didn't make it into the podcast, but is in that book in Rinsed. And there's the last couple of chapters about North Korea, and it was really satisfying to tell more about the story. We are trying now to, if we can, make a documentary about the Lazarus Group's activities and take in that stuff about the Axie Infinity job and all of the other stuff. There's some really interesting activity the North Koreans are doing around infiltration campaigns, actually blagging their way into American companies to work from inside as almost sleeper agents. So it's all of this activity. And so whilst I don't think there's going to be more episodes of the podcast, we are, as I say, if we can make this documentary and get that away, it would be great to tell the latest stuff. But a lot of that's in the latest book as well. So fascinating stuff.
Oh, you got me hooked. Right. I'm going to be adding that book to my list on Amazon.
Thank you.
And very final question. It's a fun question I often ask my guests right towards the end is, if you could have any superpower, Geoff, to abolish something in the world of work, so eliminate the thing that really grinds you, what would that be? And we're only going to do it for 24 hours because we're going to do a test and see if it improves the world or not.
Well, because I'm in the BBC, anybody who's worked with the BBC who had a meeting here will know, finding a meeting room, hence the fact I'm in this tiny cubicle where the lights keep going out, finding a meeting room is like, it's just crazy. So what I would love to get rid of is whatever system of meeting room booking every organization uses, and to implement something sensible and that bloody well works, please, for the love of God. So that's what I would overhaul in workplaces. I'm tired of wandering around with a cup of tea and a laptop, poking our heads into rooms that are supposed to be booked and finding somebody else is already in there. Every organization I come to seems to have this issue of like, which meeting room am I in? Can we please sort this out? It's 2025. Let's make this our mission. That's what I'd do.
Brilliant. Hopefully there's an AI bot or something out there that can sort this out for us. Yeah, brilliant. Well, Geoff, thank you so much. How can people find out more about the podcast, the books that you've written? How can they get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Well, I am on LinkedIn, so if you just look for Geoff White, it's Geoff with a G and White, I like the colour. But also geoffwhite.tech is my website. So all the stuff in the books is on there and my contact details on there. And always very happy to hear from people, particularly as a journalist. That's one of the joys is people getting in touch with you and giving you a little tip. So that's how they can get in touch.
Oh, brilliant. Well, Geoff, thank you so much. Really do appreciate you taking time out today. I know you're a very busy man, so I am very, very thankful for your time today.
Fantastic. Really good to speak, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's the end of another episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please do connect with me via LinkedIn and drop me a message and let me know your favorite takeaways from the episode. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Superpower School newsletter so that you can be notified of all future episodes. Simply visit the website www.superpowers.school. Thank you once again.